So for this evening's discussion, for many of you, you might be going, what is a middle power? I would like to just briefly talk about a middle power so you get a better understanding of what a middle power is. And then I want to talk about some of the recent initiatives that I think are worth discussing in the context of the Indo-Pacific and why they've happened with middle powers coming together to try and influence the rulemaking process and protect the system that really middle powers and smaller powers benefit from. And then lastly, maybe bring in the Ukraine and talk about middle powers in the EU. What are they doing, and how this bodes well or maybe not well for this part of the world. So that's my three kind of broad objectives that I want to start today's discussion with. And I won't speak more than 15 minutes because, again, the best way to learn is for us to have dialogue and share views and share interpretations. So middle powers are quite interesting. I think traditionally we've understood middle powers, and I'll give you some examples, as the Scandinavian countries, Canada, Australia, South Korea to a certain degree, and they were seen as countries that were what we call normative. They would advocate for protecting human rights or eliminating mines or trying to protect what we call human security of countries. So the so-called the right to protect civilians in other countries from their own governments. And this was by and large the actions of middle powers in the 1980s and 1990s. But with the advent of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, I think middle powers kind of ended up in a position where they didn't know quite where they should be. And they shifted focus, they shifted tack, and they started to talk about human security related issues, protecting civilians from governments. We saw prominent middle powers advocate for the banning of landmines. And they had some, I think, real repercussions that really influenced international policy and helped many people deal with some of the human security issues. But fast forward to the past 4 or 5 years, what we've seen is middle powers have changed in nature, and we've seen a few other middle powers emerge that I think have become more prominent and active. And what we've seen, especially since the former administration in the White House, the Trump administration, we saw quite a few countries become much more proactive in the international domain, and in particular Indo-Pacific. And one of those countries is Japan. Another is Australia. Another is India. And I use these three countries as middle powers for a couple different reasons. One is the way they behave. They behave in a way that they want to support international institutions, support international law as much as possible, and they're willing to divert some of their resources to supporting those institutions. Second, and I think this is particularly in the case of Japan and India, with Japan being exceptionally rich, exceptionally technological, and it does have, on paper, the ability to do things that great powers or superpowers may want to do, and that's acquire nuclear weapons and acquire a much bigger military. But it's made an active choice not to do that, to divert its resources to diplomacy, to development, to infrastructure and connectivity, and under the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, to investing in multilateralism. And what I mean by that is, leading the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, building a partnership with the European Union in terms of infrastructure and connectivity, signing the European Union-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, leading the Data Free Flow with Trust initiative, and, of course, spearheading the Quad along with the United States, Australia, and India. So what we saw under the former Prime Minister, really Japan step up to the plate and try to fill the vacuum that I think occurred when the former President of the United States, Mr. Trump, left the TPP, really started to create more transactional America First diplomacy. And middle powers in this part of the world understood this implicitly, that they needed to step up to the plate to be more proactive, not only to protect their interests from a revisionist power in this region, that's China, but they also had to step up and protect their interests in terms of a more transactional America First foreign policy. And I think that is really a substantial difference when we think about middle power politics in the 1980s and 90s compared to what we're seeing today. So some characteristics of middle powers, what I call neo-middle power diplomacy, is one, they're interested in not only protecting the international system, but also in making the rules, or rule making. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in my examples, but I'm going to bring up the example of the digital economy, the maritime domain, as well as trade. Another characteristics of new middle power diplomacy or middle power diplomacy in this region is that some of the tools they use are not so normative. They potentially will try to insulate their economies from great powers. They'll invest in their economies for the great powers. They'll form small unilateral relationships to protect themselves from great powers. So it's a very proactive approach that's not necessarily just focused on human rights and human security, but rather a very proactive approach to the pragmatic challenges within the region. A third characteristic, and I think it's really, really important, is for us to be thinking about these new middle power diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific is not necessarily always being supported by the traditional partner of middle powers, and that's the United States. And I think we saw this in particular under the former administration in the United States, where the transactional diplomacy, American first diplomacy, sometimes the extortionist diplomacy towards some of its long-standing allies, whether it's Canada forcing the reunification of NAFTA 2.0, whether it's forcing the Japanese or trying to force the Japanese to pay much more for the burden sharing agreements between the two states, or the South Koreans, and even acerbic diplomacy towards the Australians at the beginning of the Trump administration. There was a real realization that the United States, although a critical partner, may actually harm the interests of some of the allies, these middle powers, if they're not proactive in lobbying the United States, trying to influence the United States, and trying to shape the decisions of the United States and leaders. So those are kind of three characteristics that I understand in terms of this neo-middle power diplomacy and some of their actions within this region. So what kinds of actions have we seen in the Indo-Pacific region that are typical of middle power diplomacy and why it matters? So I think one of the key examples, and I mentioned earlier, is Japan and Australia and Canada and other countries coming together to sign the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. After the United States withdrew from the original Trans-Pacific Partnership, we saw an important decision by Japan and others to say that this agreement is very critical for our future. It focuses on intellectual property rights, environmental law, labor law. It's a trade agreement that's going to shape how we think about research and development over the next 10, 20, and 30 years. Basically, it's writing the rules of trade and trying to create new trade regimes that will benefit the CPTPP partners, but also really allow them to create an environment where they can really invest in research and development so that they can create the next technologies and the next tools and the next standards for a 21st century trade agreement. And the TPP-11, and as I think many of you know today, is being enlarged. We have the UK that has lodged their application to join the TPP. Of course, we have South Korea that's also lodged their application to join the TPP, although it came after Taiwan and China. But there's growing interest in the TPP as mechanisms of standard setting. And this is very important for middle powers. They need to be part of the rules-making process. And if they're not at the table making those rules, they could be on the menu. And I think that this is a really important aspect. It's an excellent example of how middle powers have been trying to shape the economy within the Indo-Pacific region. And the leaders really are and was Japan, Australia, of course, Canada is part of this, but also the smaller Southeast Asian countries, Mexico and others that decided to join the TPP-11. Another really interesting area that I think there's growing convergence between middle powers is the digital environment, the digital economy. And here we're talking about again, Japan putting forward the so-called Data Free Flow with Trust initiative at the Osaka summit back in 2019. And this is meant to try and protect the privacy of us as digital consumers, but also, again, shape the rules and regulations of the digital economy moving forward so that the market and a rules-based system and a transparent legal system is the final arbiter of how we use the digital economy. And I think most of you are already you already understand the competition right now, or one of the competitions between the United States and China right now is really in the technology realm, in the 5G realm, in the digital economy, and trying to figure out who will be setting the rules for the digital economy in the 21st century. And this is important, and I think that it goes to how we think about privacy, how we think about the standards of the digital economy, how we think about the role of state in managing and having access to the digital economy, but also how we tax it and govern this digital economy. And importantly, and I think in the context of what's happening in Ukraine, I do think that there's an accelerated interest in countries like China watching the sanctions being put on Russia right now and cutting it off from the SWIFT system and cutting it off from hard currency, cutting its banks off from trading in internationally traded currencies, that there's a real need to create a digital economy that has a digitized yuan that is insulated from these kind of tactics moving forward. So middle powers in many ways have been trying to forge some standards in the digital economy. There's a long ways to go, but I think it's another example of where middle powers are working together within this region, but also globally, to protect their interests, to try and create the rules of the road for the digital economy moving forward, and try to focus on a free and open digital space where us as consumers have our privacy protected, but also can maximize the benefits of a digital economy. A third area that I think is really interesting moving at this particular time is looking at middle power cooperation in the maritime security domain. And you might be saying, where are the middle powers working in the maritime security domain? Well, what's interesting, we see multilateral frameworks, we see Quad Plus cooperation with middle powers in this region, and we see even unilateral action of middle powers within this region to try and provide some public good in the maritime security domain. So we can look at the so-called neon operations in the Sea of Japan. And I think many of you know back in 2017, our friends in Pyongyang were launching ICBMs over Japan and doing missile tests. And of course, they had a nuclear test in northeastern North Korea on the border of China. And this resulted in sanctions being taken by the United Nations Security Council. And we saw a group of countries come together to engage in what we call sanctions evasion activities in the Sea of Japan. And basically what we saw is Canada, the UK, France, Australia, and New Zealand working together, but rotating, to provide what we call maritime domain awareness in the Sea of Japan to ensure that the North Koreans were not evading sanctions. So I think this is a really, really interesting example of how middle powers are coming together to provide some public goods in the maritime security domain. But there's other examples where we see a plug-in concept, or what we call the quadrilateral security dialogue, a Quad Plus formation. And here back in January, we saw the Canadians plug into the Quad exercises in and around Guam to work on cooperation with other middle powers and the United States. We've seen the Quad plug into the Purus exercises in and around India with the French back in April 2021, again showing that France as a middle power can cooperate with other organizations or minilaterals to provide some maritime security. And we've seen other examples of this so-called plugging in effect or bolt-in effect, where middle powers bolt into minilateral groupings like the Quad, or they form trilateral or bilateral partnerships to provide some public good within the region. Now, what's interesting, over the past year, we've seen the Germans come into the region. We've seen the French be more proactive within the region. We've seen our Japanese friends be much more proactive in the region. And Canadians, where I'm from, have become much more regularized in their presence within the maritime domain of the Indo-Pacific. And this suggests that middle powers understand that they need to step up to the plate, that they need to provide some public good to the region, and that public good is not necessarily just about capacities, so that sheer amount of assets they can provide to the region, but what capabilities can they provide to the region? And I think this is really important. In the case of Canada, they have exceptional intelligence gathering skills that have been honed through working through NATO. And they use those to provide maritime domain awareness in the region, but also working with other middle powers and the United States within the region to enhance some of the maritime domain awareness in the region. So these are really good examples of how I think middle powers are coming together in the Indo-Pacific to provide some public goods and build a stronger, more coordinated presence within the Indo-Pacific. Lastly, and I think importantly, what's happening in terms of middle power coordination or cooperation in Europe, and what does it mean for this part of the world? So what we've seen over the past 12 days since this invasion of the Ukraine happened, that we've seen the United States working alongside the European Union and individual European states to put sanctions on Russia. And those financial sanctions and limits of and enhanced surveillance of Russian oligarchs really demonstrate that middle powers working together, but also working with the United States, can really enhance the amount of security and economic and financial policies that they can lend to a particular region. So right now, our Russian friends are facing a very difficult economic situation. Their athletes are being banned from participating in sports. No longer can the Russians hold sporting events. It will be difficult for Russians to travel in and out of Russia. And of course, most of their banks have been banned from the SWIFT system. So this coordinated middle power diplomacy, working with the United States, really has created, I think, an interesting example of how middle powers are cooperating to provide some public good, in this case to push back the Russians within the region and really try to stabilize what's happening in Eastern Europe and hopefully secure the regional order within the region. What this means is that I think that if there is an equivalent challenge within the Indo-Pacific region, is that we may see middle powers working together with the United States to coordinate some of their security, diplomatic, economic, and fiscal policies within the region to strangle or choke off whatever power within this region was trying to shape or reshape the region's security architecture, economic policies, and rules and regulations and standards. And I think that this is very important for us to continue to watch. Will the middle powers continue to work with the United States, and will this cooperation be sustainable? That's an open question. It's only been 12 days into this war. Will it pay dividends? And by that I mean, will it be able to push back Putin back into Russia and reestablish Ukraine as a sovereign state? This is an open question tonight. In weeks to come, we'll find out. And third, will it send strong signals to revisionist powers in this part of the world that if they try to change the region by force or try to push standards or the adoption of behavior that goes against middle powers, that they're likely to face a similar onslaught of a comprehensive set of tools to push back against revisionist powers that are challenging global order or international order. So I think those are some important talking points that we can start today's discussion with. I look forward to your questions and comments and everything you have to say about some of the initial points that I drew up today.